Git. We linked that to a remote repository, specifically GitHub, in order for us to show off our work to other developers and maybe even get them to help us out on our projects, right? We made it easier for someone else to work with us. Then we also went into the very basics of React. We installed Node.js, and then we said, hey, you can open up your PowerShell or maybe a terminal app if you're running a different operating system. And specifically, if you're on Windows, you can find a folder, hold Shift and right-click, and you can open PowerShell directly there. And then we said, hey, you can create your own React app using npx create -react-app and giving it a name. So we can just call this blank. It will run a bunch of stuff. It'll take a minute or two, and by the end of that, you'll have your very own React project, which is where we started last time. And so last week, we gave you a very quick and dirty explanation for how a React project actually works, because our hope was to show you how components actually work and why we're actually using React at all. And so this week, we're very briefly going to spend a few minutes and actually show you how a React project actually works and what's actually going on behind the scenes, so that you'll hopefully be able to understand a little bit more as to why we use React and sort of how it works. And so I've created a blank React project here. It's just called React app. And so from here, you can see sort of the structure of our React project. And so if you head into the source folder, here's where most of the files that you're actually going to edit are. And then there's also this public folder, which has a few other files that we'll find useful. Don't worry about the node modules. Once again, that just holds a bunch of library information that we don't need to worry about right now. For now, if we head into the source directory, we'll actually look at index.js, which we didn't look at last time for very long. But for now, this is how our site is actually starting up. And it turns out that we're going to be using a index.html file that's found somewhere else within this project. And your React project will be able to find where it is, but by default, it's found within the public folder. And so if you head into this public folder and open up index.html, you'll realize that this is the very first thing that is rendered sort of when our site starts. And if we actually open up our sample React project here, I've called it React app, and then if we start it using npm start, we should hopefully be able to see this index.html file being loaded. And for now, the best way that we can show you that this is actually working is to change the title, right? Right now it says React app. If we change this title in any way, maybe to People Watching Club, and save it, you'll see that our site will update its tab title. And so it turns out that this index.html is the first thing that's actually run with our React project. And you'll notice that the other important thing here is in our body, we have this div with the ID of root. And that may seem not very useful right now, but in a second, you'll see how all of this sort of sample React project is actually being rendered on our page. If we head back over to index.js, we'll see, hey, we have this root variable, and it's using the React DOM to create sort of a root element. And for now, let's just say that, hey, this is sort of the elements that everything is going to be within. And we're defining that within React, using create root. And so from here, we're going to use some basic JavaScript in order to grab the specific element with the ID of root. And if we head back over to our index.html file, it turns out that it's actually grabbing this div in order for us to put things within it when we render our site. We can see this right away if we maybe add some text in this div, maybe add hello. If we save it, we'll see that our website shows it at the very top for a second before our sort of apt base template actually kicks in. And so if we head back over to index.js, we'll realize that we have sort of a second line of code within this file that's actually doing something, and that's root.render. And so what this is doing is it's grabbing our root component, which was grabbed using some basic JavaScript that we learned previously, right? Grabbing an element by the ID, and then it's rendering something within it. And then we're using this React strict mode tag. All that this means for now is that we want all errors to show up while we're developing. And then, hey, we're showing off this component called app. And last time we showed you what a component was in terms of an info card for a different place using an image and some text. But today, our entire website is within its own component. So if you will, you could grab this component and maybe display it twice by putting the exact same thing below it. And now if we head back over to our site, you'll realize that you can actually scroll and get a second version of the exact same site. And so that's the very basics of how your React project is actually working. It's starting in index.js. It's grabbing this div element with the ID of root from index.html, and then it's actually showing all of the things that you're rendering within it on your site. In this case, we're rendering a component called app, which we know is defined within app.js. And then this looks a lot more familiar, right? We're defining a function, and then we're showing off a bunch of sort of HTML, or in this case, JSX, within it in order to actually render out our site. And so from here, we're going to start to actually develop a very simple version of our club website. And so the first thing that you're probably going to want to see is what we're striving towards. And so this week, our hope is that by the end, we'll be able to get sort of a simple image carousel going. And so if you give me a second here for this to load, I'll show you what that looks like. And so we have some text, and we have sort of a background image, and then you can use these arrow buttons on the side in order to flip through the different images. And in this case, we have 3 of them. And so that's our goal by the end of today, is to create something like this. So just like before, you can once again create your own React app using npx create React app, right? And then giving it a name. And so in this case, I've just set up a little starter application for us called club1 before. And you can grab this code right on our GitHub if you so choose, but I'll show you the few small changes that we've made to the base React app. And so all that we've really done is we've removed some of the files that were in here, right? In the base React app, we have this like report web vitals file. We have a few test files. We've removed those, and we've just left app.js, index.js, and then their CSS files, respectively. We've also added this folder called pages, and within it, we've created a home.js page, because we're going to create the home page for our website today, and we want to separate out all of our pages as we continue to build our site. So we've made a folder called pages within source, of course, and we've created this home.js file. Then, of course, we have some images. We just grabbed these ahead of time. We put them in a folder called carousel to stay organized, but these are just 3 images. This, of course, is nothing special. And then we have this folder called CSS, in which we've defined 3 CSS files in order to make our lives a little bit easier and pretty things up while we're developing. We've gone over CSS a few lessons ago, and so our hope is that you'd be able to write all of this CSS, or of course you can check it out on our GitHub page, but for now we're just using this as a way to speed up the progress as we continue to code today. And so we'll notice when we actually look into our site here, if we head into app.js, we actually have the base project. And the best way we can see that, once again, is to run our React project, right? Head out to the folder using your PowerShell, and then use npm start to actually get it running. From here, once again, we have sort of our base React app. We've removed the icon, but that's not important. And so what we're going to want to do is actually start working on the home page. And so we'll go into our pages folder and into home.js. And the first thing that we do whenever we want to create a new page, or in this case, it really is just a component, is we have to define some sort of function, right? And so in this case, we'll just say, hey, we want a function, and we're going to create the home page, and so we'll just call it home. And so now we're going to write all of our JSX or our JavaScript in here to define what our home page is going to look like. So right away, we're just going to create a return statement. And within here, we're going to create this sort of blank HTML tag. And we haven't really shown you this before. You can think of this as just like a div that doesn't get any of the styling when we import our styling later. So this is just to hold things. It's not that important. You can replace this with a div if you think that would make it a little bit easier. And from here, we'll just define a little bit of HTML, right? We'll just spend a minute creating a section, and we'll give it a class name of maybe carousel, and we'll say, hey, this is where our carousel will be. And then maybe we'll define one more section on our site. Maybe we want to just display some text, right? So we'll create a class name in there, and we'll give it, maybe it's going to be the about section. And within here, we could define a bunch of stuff. Maybe we want to define a div with maybe an info card, and we could continue to build out our site this way. And once we save this file, unfortunately, nothing will actually happen. And that's because we haven't actually told our React app to render this page, right? So if we head back over to index.js, we're only showing the app page. And so we could, of course, then go into app.js and realize, hey, look, here's what we're actually rendering, right? It's this edit the source app.js file and save to reload. And so we'll get rid of all of this sort of base HTML that is provided with the project, and if we save, we'll notice that our site will update, and it will get mad at us because we're not returning anything, and that's okay. For now, we can just return a div, and it will become happy with us again. Now our website's completely blank, and that's okay because we want to display our home page, not the predefined text that was in here before. And so the first thing that we're going to have to do is say, hey, well, I want to display the home component. So just like last time, we'll grab the name of the component, and we'll close it off early because we don't want to put anything in it. And then we'll save our file, and hey, React's going to yell at us because it doesn't know what home actually is. And so once again, we're going to have to write one of these import statements in order to grab our home component from another file. And so the way that we do that is we say, hey, from, and then we grab the file that we're looking for. And so in this case, we're looking for home, which is within pages. So we'll use /pages, and then we'll grab, hey, we want home. And so from this actual file here, we want to import home. And I think it's actually the other way around. I think it's import home from the file. There we go. And so now when we save, hopefully everything will be fixed. And unfortunately, it's not. And if we head back over to our home page, we'll realize that, hey, we forgot to write an export at the very bottom, right? We have to say export, and we'll say by default, this is the function that we want to export. So we'll say export default home. And this just says that, hey, other pages in other parts of our sort of application are able to access this function and use it. And then we'll notice, hey, look, on our site, our website is actually updating with the home component that we defined in here, right? If we make some changes to this, change the text, our site will update. And so now we have our home component or home page actually displaying within our site. From here, we're going to want to start to define our sort of image carousel, right? That part of our site where we have an image and then 2 buttons to click back and forth and then a little bit of text. And it turns out that maybe the best way to do this is to create a component, because what if we want to use this sort of this carousel on a different part of our website later, right? Maybe the home page isn't the only place we want it. And so for now, we're going to create a component to allow other developers or even ourselves to reuse this code later. And so within our source folder, we're going to create a new folder. We'll call it components. And then within this folder, we'll create a file called carousel.js. And just like our home sort of component, for lack of a better word, we're going to create a function right away. And in this case, we'll call the function carousel, and it will take in maybe some props. And we figured out what props were last time. They were just a way for us to pass information along to a component. And that way, whenever somebody calls this component, they can change how it's actually displayed. Last time we used different images in different locations, and this time we're going to use a few different images to show what we're actually going to click through. And so then we're going to actually start to define this function. And so the first thing that we're going to need to do is figure out some way to store what image we're on, right? We have 3 images, and some way we're going to pass those images to this component using props. We'll get to that later, but for now, we need a way for the user to actually update and change with the images. We're going to use buttons for that. But in React, it turns out we have this thing called state in order for us to sort of store the individual user's information related to where they're on the site. This is, for lack of a better word, it's a way for a user to interact with the site that won't actually change the site in the long run. And so that may seem a bit confusing, but we'll do a quick example to show you what that actually means. And so the first thing that we have to do when we're going to use state is we have to actually import it, just like any other function. And so in this case, to import state, we'll have to say, hey, I want to import something, and we want to import this function called useState, and where we get it from is actually from React. So that seems all good. And so now we're going to define our first version of state on our site. And to do that, we'll use, hey, we're going to define a constant, and we're going to use these square brackets. And this is something kind of weird called destructuring. But for now, let's just, in these square brackets, define 2 variables. And in this case, we'll call one state, and we'll call the other one setState. And then we'll set this equal to this sort of useState function. And it turns out we have to give it a starting value. And so for now, let's just give it a starting value of 0. And if we save our file, everything seems OK, right? It's not yelling at us, so hopefully we've done everything right. And from here, let's just for now say, hey, I want to return. And usually we'd have to write some JSX in here, so let's just make a div. And within this div, let's show off the actual value of state, right? And if we remember to last time, we use curly braces when we want to write some JavaScript code within sort of our JSX HTML that we're returning. And so if we use these curly braces and type state in here and save our file, hopefully this component will now return to us the value of state by displaying it on our site. And once again, unfortunately, nothing's going to happen, and that's because we've done a few things wrong here, right? First, we haven't actually exported this function, right? So once again, we want to export default carousel, And that way, other parts of our site are able to call on this function in order to turn it into an actual component. Right? Then we'll head back over to our home page, and we want to replace this sample text where we said, hey, this is where our carousel is going to go, with our actual carousel component, right? So we'll create that carousel component this way. We'll use that slash once again because we don't want to put anything within it for now. And then, once again, we have to actually import it. And so we'll have to say, hey, import carousel, and we're going to grab that from the components folder. So we'll use // and then components, and then carousel is the file. And the reason that we use 2 dots this time is because we're in the pages sort of folder, which is within source, right? And so we need to go up one directory into the source directory, and then we need to grab components, and then the carousel file. And now hopefully when we save, our website will update, and you'll see that all it's displaying is just the number 0. And it turns out, if we head back over to carousel, that is what we set the default value of our state to be, right? We set it to 0 by passing along this value to that function. If we change this in some way, for example, to maybe hello, that's what's going to be displayed on our site. And it turns out that we can actually interact with this value in some way. A few weeks ago, we created a simple form using buttons, but it turns out we can also use buttons to interact with our site in another way. So if we, for example, define a button, and if we said, click me to increase, right? If we then say, hey, we know that every button, when we're writing React, has this onClick value, which allows us to define what happens when you actually click this button. So if we say, hey, onClick, and then it turns out we have to provide this with a function. So we'll create an arrow function right in here because we don't want to reuse this later, right? This is just a one-off. And so we can create this arrow function, of course, using their parentheses, the equal sign, and then sort of the right arrow. And then in this function, for now, we'll just say, hey, let's console.log increase, so we know that this is working. And then maybe let's set state equal to 1. And so it turns out that we can change the value of this state variable by using the function setState. And that's what happens every time we call useState. It returns to us 1, a variable which stores the actual value of state. In this case, I've called it state. And then second, it returns you a function in order for you to call that function to actually update that value. So in this case, we're going to set state equal to 1. And hopefully, if we save our file, we should see our button show up. If we open up our Inspect tab, and if we open up into the console, hopefully when we click this button, we'll see a log out to the console that says increase, which is what we defined to happen when we click this button. And notice how setState set the value of state to 1, and then state, which is being shown right here, actually updates on our site. And now we see the number 1. And of course, if we click this again, unfortunately, it's still set to 1 because we are only setting state equal to 1. And so maybe we want to increase this by 1. So we can grab the current value of state and maybe add 1 to it. And hopefully this will fix that bug. And whenever we click on it, we'll see that this number will increase. This may seem like a pretty rudimentary example, but state is exactly what we're going to use sort of throughout this lesson in order to create that image carousel, right? We need some way to store what image the user is on, right? Are they on the first image, the second image, or the third image? Or, I mean, this is a component that could be used anywhere. So maybe the developer is able to put up to 10 images, or even 100. And we need some way to be able to tell what image the user is currently on, so when they click that button, we can update it to the next or the previous image. And so from here, let's start to actually build out a little bit of what our sort of image carousel is going to look like. And so for now, we're actually just going to return something, right? We'll create maybe a blank div in here, and maybe we will give it a class, right? Because we're going to use some of that pre-made CSS that we defined before. So maybe we'll give it the class of slider styles. And then maybe within this div, we will define another one. And we'll give this the class name of carousel inner. And this is going to be where we're going to store the image for our carousel, right? Within this div is where all of our arrows and maybe our text is going to go. And so from here, we'll say, hey, this is going to store our image. And then within this div, we're also going to create a div for maybe the left button. So we'll give it a class name of left, and we'll say, hey, this is the left button. Then, I mean, maybe our images have some text to go along with it. So maybe we will define one more div, and we'll give it a class name of center to make it centered and everything. And then maybe we'll say, hey, we want a heading, and maybe this will just say Queen's University for now. And then we want one final div once again, because if we can go left, naturally we're going to want the user to be able to go right. So we'll give this a class name of right, and we'll say, hey, this will be our right button. And if we save this, this is going to look a bit cryptic, but for now, we have all of the components that we're going to want to work with. We have something for the left button, we have something for the right button, and we have somewhere to put our image. The next thing that we're going to want to do from here is somehow we need to give our image to this component, right? We don't have a way so far to give an image to be displayed. And so for now, we're going to head back over to our home.js file and realize that, hey, we have some of these images within this image folder, and we need some way to pass those along. And we learned last time that we can use props to pass things between components. And so the first thing that we're going to want to do is import all of these images for use within this file. And it turns out that you can import an image just like you can import a component. So we can say, hey, I want to import, maybe I'll call it carousel image 1, and where I want to import it from is from this image file. And so because we're within this pages subdirectory, we'll use 2 dots to go up one directory. We'll go into our image folder, and we'll say, hey, I want to go into the carousel folder, and then from there, I want to grab carousel1.png. And it turns out we can do this 2 more times in order to grab the other 2 images, right? So we'll grab carousel image 2 from the second PNG, and then we'll grab the third one real quick here. And so to know that this works, let's just simply try to display one of these images. And it turns out we can create an image tag just like we would in HTML. We can close this off using a backslash because we don't want to put anything within it. That's okay for now. And so then we'll give it the source of one of these images, and maybe we'll give it carousel image 1. And if we save our file, hopefully our site will update with that image. And it turns out it doesn't seem to want to. And so hopefully, I've got my import line right. Maybe the file name is slightly different, so let me try that. So next we can probably check the elements, and let's see if there's actually an image within our root. So there's our root sort of div that we defined earlier. There's our carousel section, and it turns out that there is an image right here. We just can't really see it, and maybe I'm just zoomed in far. There we go. So I'm zoomed in way too far to actually see the image. There it is. It's actually defined there. And so we could change this sort of source, maybe to carousel image 2, and save our file. And hey, look, our image updates to the second one. And it turns out that what we alluded to before is that these images are actually kind of just links on our site. And we can see that in sort of our Elements tab here. If we hit that, sort of hover over the source part, and we look at this bottom here, it'll say, hey, the current source is localhost, static, media, blah, blah, blah. And if we click on this, we'll get to just the image. And it turns out that we can use this image anywhere on our site by using this link because we've imported it on our home page. So from here, we want some way to pass these images along, right? We want to give these images to our carousel to be displayed. And it turns out, I mean, we could just say, hey, image 1 is equal to the first image 2 is equal to the second image, and so on. But what if a developer suddenly wants 4 images, and we only accounted for 3? Instead, maybe a better way would be to pass an array of images along. That way the developer can decide how many images they want to show. Maybe they only want 2, or maybe another one wants 5. And so we could instead create an array. And so we'll call our array maybe carousel images. And of course, we can create an array using square brackets, just like we can in Python. And then we're going to pass individual sort of objects, or in this case, individual dictionaries to define each image. And so in this case, we'll define our first one as maybe carousel image 1. And so we'll give it maybe an ID of 1. We'll say, hey, maybe we wanted to have some text as well with this image to describe what's going on. So we'll say maybe have a seat. And then more importantly, we want to grab the source of this image. And so we'll give it carousel image 1. And then we can continue to define these, right? We could create 2 more, one for our second image. We'll give it an ID of 2. We'll give it a slightly different subtitle of maybe a sunny day, and we'll give it carousel image 2. And we'll do this one more time just to grab our third one. And this may seem a bit much, but we can see here how we could continue to add a bunch more images and then pass these to our carousel component. And so right now, nothing's actually happening, right? We're just defining this array. We can, of course, log it out to console if we want to see what it looks like. Carousel images right here. If we then save that, head over to our console, we'll see, hey, look, it's an array with 3 items in it, and within each item is this individual image. And so next, we're going to want to pass it along to our carousel using props. So we're going to say, hey, within carousel, we're going to define this value called images, and we're going to set it equal to of course, carousel images. And remember that we're using these curly braces whenever we want to use some JavaScript within our return statement. So if we then save our file, and if we head back over to carousel, if we maybe printed out console.log the value of props, if we then save, we'll see over here, here is our props value right here, and within our props value we have a key called images, and within that key is our array that holds our 3 images. Right? So we've successfully passed along our images from our home page into our image carousel. And so now we can actually work with them if we so chose. Right? We could maybe go in here and say, hey, I want to display one of these images. So I could create an image tag, and once again, I could define its source. And maybe I set the source equal to, hey, props.images. And it looks like nothing actually happens. And that's because props.images is an array containing 3 images, right? It's not an actual image. And so if we did instead props.images of maybe 0 to grab the 0th item, or in this case actually the first item, because arrays in JavaScript, just like Python, are 0 indexed, right? You use 0 to get at the first item. And then we could maybe grab, hey, I want the source of that image. And that's just going to grab the source value right here, which, remember, if we head back over to home, our source value is our actual import statement for our image, right? So this is directly looking at the image. If we then save our carousel, we'll notice, hey, look, our image is actually going to be displayed here. We'll head back over to home, and we'll just delete this example image right here so we don't get confused later. And if we save, we'll see that, hey, look, our images that were being passed along, we can actually display within our carousel, right? So once again, our props are actually working here. From here, maybe we want to use this state value to maybe update what image is being displayed, right? We alluded to wanting the user to be able to decide what image is being shown. And so maybe instead of grabbing the 0th item, we use a variable instead. And in this case, we've already defined the state and set state above in order to change this value. And so we'll grab our value of state here. Remember, the first one actually stores the value, and the second one lets us update it. So we'll grab state, and we'll put it in here for the value of that numeral, sort of that number, that's going to index our array, right? And right now it's equal to 0, right? We're setting it to 0 by default. We can log it out into the console as well. We'll say console.log, here is the state, and then we'll provide state. And if we save this, we'll notice that nothing really changes. If we check our console, we can see that our state is 0, and that's because the 0th image, of course, is by default the first one, right? If we then set useState to 1, that will update the value of state to 1 when we refresh our page. If we check console, it will say here is the state 1, and now look, our image is different. It's been updated. If we once again maybe updated this to 2 and saved and refreshed, look, once again, we're on the 3rd image now. And so look, if we found a way to change the state value via the user's input in some way, they could change what image is actually being displayed. The next thing that we're going to do is a little bit cryptic, but for now, know that it's very hard to make an image tag sort of transparent, right? In our example at the beginning, we wanted to put some text on top of our image. And it turns out the best way to do this is instead to set the background of our div. If you recall, quite a few weeks back, we showed you this weird example where we created some rainbow text by setting a gradient background. And that may have seemed a bit much, and honestly it was. It wasn't the most efficient way to do that. But it's, once again, another way for us to show you this sort of background image value. And so if we head back over to this carousel inner, we're going to want to set this to our background image so that all of our text and buttons can be displayed on top of it. And so it turns out, once again, in React, we can use this style tag, just like we used in HTML, in order to define some CSS styling right on our page. We'll open up some curly braces just because we want to write some JavaScript within here. And we'll actually open up the curly braces one more time because we're going to pass this sort of an object. This just means that we can define multiple CSS things in here if we wanted to, but for now, we're only going to do one. And so in here, we could say, hey, I want to set the background image. So we could say, hey, I want to set background image, and what we want to set that equal to is one of these images that are being passed along. And it turns out that these images are actually just URLs. They're just links to the image being stored somewhere on our website. And we can actually see that if we head into our console, and if we look at these images that are being printed out, that are being passed along, right? Look, the source is static media carousel blah, blah, blah. But if we copy this into our address bar, and if we sort of remove the quotation marks, we'll see that it actually links directly to our image, albeit a little bit small, but there it is. Our image is right there. And so maybe if we use this URL in some way, we can actually set the background image. And so the first thing that we have to do is we have to say, hey, we're going to use this weird sort of tilde. It's right below the escape. And this is a way to make sort of a fancy string. It'll let you put a variable right into a string. And this won't make much sense right now, but if you give me a second, just pretend that this is a string. We'll then say, hey, I want this to be a URL, so we'll say URL, and we'll open up our parentheses. And within the parentheses, we have to give a URL to an image on our site somewhere. And it turns out we can use our props for that, like before. But if we start to type in here, if we start to say, hey, I want props.images, and maybe I want the first one, and then I want .source, if we save this, it's not going to be very happy with us, right? If we comment out our image that's being displayed before, and if we check our sort of HTML here, we'll notice that we don't have a background image, right? If we go into the body here, and if we go in even further, we'll find the carousel here, and we'll see, hey, look, our background image, there isn't one. And that's because, hey, this is just giving in the actual text, right? We want this to be a variable instead, and that's why we use this sort of weird tilde string. We can now use sort of a number sign and then open up our curly braces, and that will say, hey, we want to put a JavaScript variable in here instead. And now, if we save our file, hopefully an image will actually show up for the background here. And it looks like nothing's actually going to show up, and that's because we haven't edited our CSS in order to allow a background image. And so for now, I'm going to say, hey, let's just import our CSS from before. If we go into CSS and then carousel, we'll see that there is a bunch of CSS in here. Most importantly, we have our carousel inner here, and it's defining how it's displaying everything and all of that stuff. And so I think, there we go, this one. This is defining how our background image works. And so if we head back over to carousel, we can import CSS, and it will actually automatically apply it to our site. We don't have to manually link it like we had to with our previous pure HTML approach. And so if we just say, hey, I want to import, and if we head into CSS, and then if we grab the carousel file, if we then save, hopefully our CSS will update on our site. And it doesn't seem to have. And maybe we need to include .css. So then it looks like everything is OK. We have this big red blotch on our site. But hopefully, once we fix up our image here, we should get it to update. And it looks like maybe I spelled this carousel inner wrong, potentially. And that's probably what's causing me issues. There we go. So now if I sort of zoom out a lot, it turns out everything's really big right now, we see that we now have a background image defined. And it looks like, hey, if we change this value to maybe 1, look, the image changes. And that's what we want. That's great. Once again, just like how we had before, we're going to change this sort of manual variable where I'm changing it from 1, 2, and 3 manually to that state value, right? So that we can change it later, maybe using buttons like we changed it in that counting example where we increased, right, 1, 2, 3, 4. So we'll put state here instead and save it, and look, everything's okay. It still is showing an image. Now let's look at these buttons that we're defining, right? We've got this left button, and this will be our right button, and they're massive, and that's okay. But let's start with the left button. And what do we want the left button to do? Well, we want it to maybe go to the image on the left, which will maybe be decreasing the actual image that we're looking at. And so in this case, we have sort of this div here, and it says left button. And what we want is every time we click on this left button, we want to decrease the image, right? We want to go 1 to the left. And so it turns out, just like how we defined onClick with a button, you can actually define onClick with a div as well. So if we say onClick, and then we, once again, we need to use curly braces to say that we're going to write some JavaScript here. And then we need to define a function right away to be called. And so we're going to use an arrow function because we want to sort of define this right here. We don't want to define it in another part of our file. And what we want to happen is maybe, hey, we want to set the value of state to maybe the current value of state minus 1. And so if we save our file here, and if we refresh our page, it turns out that this left button, this div here, actually becomes a left button. And whenever I click it, it decreases the value of state. State is now equal to 1, so it's showing a new image. And if I click it again, state is now equal to 0, and it's showing another new image. But unfortunately, if I click it one more time, my page goes blank. And that's because the value of state is now -1, and it doesn't know what image to show for that. And so it turns out we're going to have to set some way for this not to sort of overflow. And the way that we'll do that is we can use maybe a little if statement. And maybe we'll say, hey, if the value of state is maybe sort of larger than 0, then we'll be allowed to decrease it by 1. And so we'll put this within an if statement, and then we'll save and we'll refresh our page to reset the state. And you'll notice, hey, look, now if I click the left button, it reaches a point where I can't click it anymore. I can't go left anymore, and that's what we want to happen. Right now, left button is just this text that says left button, and that's probably not what we want, right? Maybe we want to use even this just simple left character on our keyboard, right? The one right above Alt. And if we type that in and then save, React is going to get very angry with us because we use that character in order to define stuff within sort of HTML, right? It thinks that we're trying to define an element and we forgot to close it, and that's a problem. And so it turns out, just like how we imported that copyright sign, we can say, hey, what's the HTML character code for this symbol? And this may seem a bit weird, but if we go onto this site, we can see by actually selecting this symbol that it has an HTML code of this. And if we just copy this and paste it in here and save, you'll notice if we head back over to our site, it will update, and now we'll have this little arrow that we can press. And so for some characters, you're not going to be allowed to directly type them in. Your program will get mad at you. And the way that you get around that is by using this sort of HTML character code, which converts it into the correct character once it's on your site. Now we have a left button. Naturally, we're probably going to want a right button. And if we get rid of this sort of static image or sort of text at the top, our site will start to look a little bit better. So now we're going to do the same thing that we did with our left button with our right button. And so we're going to say, hey, here's our right button here. Once again, it's a div, and it still lets us create this onClick. And it turns out within sort of onClick, we're able to pass a function if we so chose, and we can actually define this function anywhere. So if I actually scroll up to the top here, I could define this function up here if I wanted to. Maybe I want to use it multiple times. And so I could create a function, and I could say on right click, and once again, we'll just define a function like we normally do. And what do I want to happen? Well, I want to increase the value of state by 1, right? I want to go to the right. If they're on the first image, I want them to get to the second image. And the way that we do that is we set the value of state to the current value plus 1. And if we then save, we'll see, hey, our program is angry at us. And if we actually scroll in and read our error message, it's saying, hey, onClick doesn't actually have a value here. And I said before that we have to give it a function. And it turns out we can give it this function that we defined up here of onRightClick. If we just grab the name, and if we put it into this onClick value here and save, it turns out that whenever we click on this sort of right set of text here, it will actually go to the right. And once again, we have this unfortunate problem where if we go too far to the right, maybe to the value of 4 or 5, our website doesn't know what to do, and it blanks out. It doesn't know what to set the background of, so you can't see everything else. And once again, we're going to want to set up an if statement in here to say, hey, if the value of maybe state is, I don't know, smaller than, in this case, what, 3? And then if we save, we'll click go to the right. Oh, it looks like we actually want this to be 2. And if we save and try to click to the right, this won't work. Now, this approach works, right? Our program now works, right? Our left button works, our right button works. If we quickly grab sort of this HTML character code for the right button and replace it with this set of text, you'll be able to see much better. If we head back over to our site, this looks pretty good. It seems to work, right? The left and right button. But what happens now if I try to add an extra image, right? If I head over back to home and maybe I add one more image, and in this case, I'll just make it the very first image again, but that's okay. If I then save this, if I head back over, if I head all the way to the left, I'm on the first image, now the second, and now the third, but I can't get to my fourth image. And that's because we didn't make this truly dynamic. We didn't make this usable for another developer if they had 4 images. We only made this for 3. And so instead of saying, hey, I want this sort of right click to only work if we're smaller than 2, we're instead going to use images sort of props.images.length. And we said a few lectures ago when we did JavaScript that arrays have a bunch of these built-in values that you can use and might be useful later on. And it turns out length is one of them, and it just returns you the length of that array. And now if I save, hopefully we can click the right arrow all the way to the right and see 1, 2, 3, 4 images. Unfortunately, if I click it one more time, we have that blank screen again, and that's because we want the length of the images -1. And it turns out now, hopefully, I can go all the way to the right, and I can see all 4 images. and a developer could continue to add more images if they so chose. And you can see here now we have a component that will work for any developer on any site. And there's just one more sort of weird syntax thing that I want to show you. In our final code for this week, we actually use this sort of cryptic syntax where we say, hey, if the state, I guess it's easiest to show you with the left button. So if I grab it here, we say, hey, if the state is larger than 0, then we'll say and then we'll set the state equal to state minus 1. And what's actually happening here is it will first check for the first value, and then this and will only proc if the first value is true. And then it will go to the second value. And if you've done some Python, this might make a little bit more sense. But all that I want to say is if you go back and if you read our final code for this week, we'll use syntax like this on our onClick. And this is actually the exact same thing as saying, hey, if the state is larger than 0, then we'll set the state to state minus 1. And so it looks like our version of our site here is pretty much complete, except we have one more final problem. In our home, we defined this sort of subtitle, right? A little bit of text that we want to display as well. And if we head back over to our carousel, we can actually start to display this text. Maybe under our heading, we'll say, hey, I want to grab at this text. So once again, we want to grab at our props, and we want to grab at all of the images. Maybe we want to grab the first one for now, and we'll grab right away the, I think I called it subtitle. There we go. So if I then save, hey, look, we have some text here. Unfortunately, I've just used 0 again, so if I start clicking through, nothing will update. And once again, we want to use the value of state here, right? Because our buttons are actually updating the value of state. If we sort of reset our site here, you'll see that as we click through the images, the text on our site also updates. And this is the big sort of benefit to using React. We can have versions of our site that a user can interact with, and it won't change the original version of the site at all. If we see that very easily here, if I open up a new browser, for example, and if I open up our site again, you'll notice that as one user clicks through the different images, it doesn't affect the base version of the site at all. And it turns out state is completely local to the user who's viewing it, right? Their value of state, in this case on the right, maybe the value is 2, and on the left, maybe the value is 1, and that's okay. Every user can interact with our site in a different way, and that's how you get some of those truly interactive sites actually working, right? Maybe when you were learning to program, you saw sort of Scratch, right? That very interactive version of programming right in your browser, and it turns out that they probably use something similar to state a whole bunch of times in order to store the code that you've currently written on your site. And that's why if somebody else goes to that Scratch site, nothing has actually changed, right? It's still the same for them. And so this is sort of how we can start to make our websites truly dynamic. And this is one of the true benefits of React. And so today we went over state in order to make your website sort of a little bit more dynamic, make it, give it the ability for a user to interact with it. And so once again, using React, we can define these components, and we can render these components within our site. And then using those components, we can once again use state inside of them in order to change things within our website. And so that is it for this week. I think we switch off into social now, and thank you for coming.